Okay, welcome everybody to this last talk in this afternoon session on BSBI activities during lockdown. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Kevin Walker and I'm the Head of Science at the BSBI, where I'm mainly in charge of monitoring and recording activities. And what I'd like to talk to you about in this session is two projects, in particular the BSBI Garden Wildflower Hunt, which we launched in April this year, right at the start of lockdown. And also I'd just like to give you a brief update on Atlas 2020, which is our sort of flagship recording project, which has been going on for about the last 20 years. So I'll just give you a very brief update on that project as well. But first to the BSBI Garden Wildflower Hunt. So as I said before, this was launched right at the start of lockdown in April earlier this year. And it was a very simple project where we were just asking participants to record all the wildflowers that they found growing wild in their gardens. And by wild, we were really asking people to look for native species, so species that are native in Britain and Ireland, that were naturalised in their gardens. So they weren't planted ornamentals, all native species that had been planted in seed mixtures, for example, to create wildflower areas. So really just interested in the natives growing wild in gardens. And this slide here, you can see there's lots of planted ornamentals, but you can see here we've got foxgloves. And I know they're wild because this is my front garden. And they sort of appeared a couple of years ago, and we've just let them sort of spread around the garden. We've also got a little bit of bramble here, which is snuck in under the Leylandii hedge. And there's a few other things growing in the gravel. So they're mainly the things we're looking for. The sort of wild plants within urban or suburban gardens. Okay, and the other main thing to say about this project is that anyone can take part. You don't need to be a member of the BSBI. You don't need to be a particularly expert botanist. It's really for anyone who wants to record the wild plants in their garden. And finally, we're quite happy for anyone to take part in terms of their garden. You know, any garden, whatever the size, whatever features it's got, we're quite happy to receive the information for those gardens. Okay, so the main aims, so it's probably fairly obvious. The first aim, we really want to improve our knowledge of the wild plants that grow in gardens. And why do we really want this information? Well, it's probably safe to say that botanists have generally or traditionally ignored gardens. And that's largely because within our recording guidelines, we basically ask botanists to stop at the garden fence. So we generally don't encourage recording in gardens. But the exception to that is rare species. So within our database, we have lots of records of rarities that have appeared in gardens. And I just put this example here, which is the lizard orchid, Himantoglossum hircinum. And you see that this is growing in someone's front lawn where they've left it uncut. And this is in Sandwich in Kent, not far from the large native colony on the golf course there. But by and large, most species, most wild native flowers don't tend to get recorded in gardens. And that's quite surprising, given the area that gardens cover in Great Britain. So we think around about 2% of the GB land area is made up by gardens, and that's an area equivalent to Hampshire. So it's a very big area. The other reason we're interested in gardens is that they often provide refuges for many species which have declined in the wider countryside, often because of damaging land uses, such as the use of fertilisers, pesticides and herbicides within agriculture. So gardens can provide refuges and can have quite interesting floras, and we're quite keen to learn a bit more about that. And then finally, we know that people are getting more interested in the wildflowers and the wildlife in general within their gardens over recent years, and particularly they're starting to manage their gardens more sympathetically for biodiversity. And a good example of that during lockdown was Plant Life's No Mow May project, where they're encouraging people to not mow their lawns to see what wildflowers are growing in the gardens, but also to allow an increase in sort of floral resources for pollinators. Okay, so the second main aim of the project was just really to give an opportunity for botanists of all creeds to improve their ID skills, and particularly beginners and novices, and improve their skills by looking more closely at the sort of plants that were growing in their, on their doorstep in their garden. And then finally, and possibly most importantly, we were just trying to create an enjoyable botanical activity that people could take part in during the lockdown months. So as I said, we launched this right at the start of lockdown, when we're all feeling a bit depressed about the thought of being locked down for, well, we didn't know then it was going to be 2 or 3 months, and so this was really to give people an opportunity to go out into their gardens and see what was growing there, and do something that was quite worthwhile for botany. Okay, so I'll just say a little bit about how the scheme actually works. So it's an online recording project, so the information is basically entered onto a phone app, this one shown here, or on a web page. So you just go to this website, either on your phone or your computer, and you click the Get Started button, and that just takes you to an online recording form shown here, where we're gathering a little bit of information about you and your garden. So where did you do the survey? You can provide a postcode and a grid reference, and also the date of your survey. And you can see on this side, we were gathering a little bit of information about your garden, just to help in the analysis when we're coming to look at the different species and the number of species recorded in gardens. So the first thing we wanted to know, what was the size of your garden? So you could just click on there's basically about 6 categories in terms of the size. And also we were asking participants to just tick these boxes here, just to say which features they had in their gardens, such as lawns, herbaceous borders, rockeries, paved areas, gravel areas, hedges, ponds and other water bodies. So really it's just to get an idea of sort of how diverse these gardens were in terms of their overall habitats. Okay, so once you've entered that information, you can start to enter the actual species that you find. It's very simple. You just click on and add a plant record, find the species and add that to the list. And there's also an option to add a bit of free text information about the species. So ideally, we were asking people to just submit records of naturalised plants and gardens, but we found many people were actually submitting records of natives that they had planted or seeded, and often that gave them an opportunity to say that when they planted it. It was interesting as well. Many of the comments that were submitted with these records were really saying how much these species were hated in the garden. So particularly weedy species, there was lots of comments like an absolute thug or a complete nuisance. I've been trying to get rid of it for years. So it's quite useful to get this sort of information in terms of which species were not only native but also causing a nuisance to gardeners. Okay, so I'll just say a little bit about the results. To date, we've had 627 gardens entered into the scheme, and you can see we've had a very good spread across the whole of Britain and Ireland. Most of the surveys, not surprisingly, are mainly in sort of the urban areas, so around London and in the Midlands. So we've had about 500 surveys done in England, but there's also a good spread up in Scotland, across Wales and the southwest, and a small number from Ireland. So quite a good spread of records. So in total, since April, so over the sort of last 6-7 months, we've had a total of 22,000 records submitted as part of the scheme. As I said, quite a number of people submitted records of garden ornamentals, and also native species that they've planted within their gardens. We also decided to remove planted trees and shrubs that are native, because often these are almost certainly planted in sort of garden locations. So once we removed all those species for this analysis, that gave us about 16,000 records of native plants in gardens. And you can see from this graph here, which just shows the number of records submitted by month, that the vast majority of records came in April, right at the start of lockdown. Not surprising, we're all looking for things to do during those early days of lockdown. But a fair few records came in May and June, and then it looks like once lockdown had finished, much fewer records were sort of sent in. Okay, and then if we look at the number of species that were recorded in each garden, so this histogram just shows that the numbers in terms of the number of gardens. So you can see over here we had the garden with the highest number of species, had an incredible 187 species recorded. But actually, I think it's stretching a bit to call this a garden. You can see it's this area here. It's actually a house with a lot of woodlands, some meadows, fields, and water features. So that was quite an extreme outlier. In terms of the sort of average, the majority of the gardens had less than 10 species, and the average overall was 25 species per garden. And you can see that the interquartile range, so the middle 50% of gardens, had sort of between 5 and 35. So that gives you a much better idea of the sort of numbers that people have been finding. And we can also look at the number of species recorded in relation to garden size. So we had 6 garden size categories going from very small, so 1 here at less than 50 meters squared up to greater than 800 meters, greater than 800 meters squared. You can see there's a very strong relationship with garden size, not unexpectedly, with the smallest gardens having on average around about 10 species, and the bigger gardens, the largest gardens, having over 40. And again, we can look at the number of species in relation to the number of features that people had in gardens. So again, the x-axis just showing the number of features, and then the y-axis, the average number per garden. And you can see that the numbers go up quite gradually with the more features you have in the garden. And that's obviously quite understandable. The one thing that we didn't collect information on is the management of the garden, and obviously that will have a big effect on the numbers of species. But we haven't been collecting that as part of the survey, but it's something that we may want to look into in the future as part of the project. Okay, so these are just the top 10 natives that were recorded as part of the survey. So once we'd excluded all the garden ornamentals and also the trees and shrubs, that left us with 671 native and archaeophyte species, which incredibly is around about 40% of British and Irish species that were recorded in this survey within those 627 gardens. And possibly, as all gardeners already know, the most frequent species in the gardens recorded was dandelion in 71% of the gardens, followed by daisy, herb robert, cleavers, creeping buttercup, and stinging nettle. So these are probably not much of a surprise to many of us, and particularly not gardeners who find these things as a complete nuisance in their gardens. And we can also look at the results in terms of the sort of habitats that these species are associated with. And again, this just shows the percentage of garden occurrences for those species in relation to the sort of broad habitat types. And you can see that the species that were most abundant in gardens are those associated with sort of boundary habitats, such as hedgerows, grasslands, so neutral grassland and improved grassland, which obviously links to lawns, woodland, and also arable, which obviously relates to the sort of cultivated areas in gardens. Okay, so we also had quite a number of quite interesting and rare species recorded as part of the survey, and just for a bit of fun, I just thought I'd put in the top the most frequently recorded orchid species. So common spotted orchid was the most frequently recorded species in about 6% of the gardens, bee orchid in 2%, northern marsh orchid and pyramidal in 1%, southern marsh, broadleaf, helleborine and twayblade in less than 1% of gardens. And there were a fair number of other orchids recorded, including autumn ladies, tresses, man orchid, white helleborine. So quite a range of the British orchid flora seems to occur in gardens. Okay, so and this project's quite useful, particularly for species like bee orchid, because it's actually we know that this species is spreading or has spread very rapidly over the last 20 years. So this map on the right just shows the distribution of the species as it is now, and the dark dots represent hectads where it's first recorded since 2000. So you can see that it's infilled lots of its range in here, sort of spreading in South Wales, but it's particularly spreading up on the northern edge of its range, up here in the Durham, Northumberland coast, and also into Scotland. It was first recorded in Scotland in 2003, and we now have sort of 5 or 6 hectads right at the north end of its range now. And quite a number of these new populations are turning up in, well, in gardens and on road verges in urban environments, where they're obviously benefiting from the sort of warmer winters that we're having over the last sort of 10 or 20 years. So this sort of survey is sort of helping to explain some of the movement of this species. Okay, so that was just a brief update on the garden wildflower hunt. Now I just wanted to spend 10 or so minutes just talking a little bit about the Atlas 2000 project. For those of you not familiar with this project, this is the 3rd distribution atlas of the British and Irish flora that we're producing, and fieldwork for this atlas has been taking place since 2000, and it ended at the end of 2019, thankfully just before lockdown came in. So in that period, botanists across the whole of Britain and Ireland have been busy going out into as many hectads as they could possibly get into, and recording the species that they find, both native and alien. And during that period, they've collected over 20 million records, which is an incredible feat when you think that for the last atlas, around 7 million records were collected. So we've more than doubled the number of records collected for this atlas compared to the last atlas. And another main difference between this atlas and the last atlas is that we plan to publish it online rather than as a book. So the last 2 atlases were the rather large weighty tomes full of maps, but this time we're going to have it online on a web page where it's free for anyone to access it. Okay, so the key thing that the online atlas will include are distribution maps, as in the previous atlases, but because it's a website, we don't have any restriction on the sort of amount of information that we can put on. So in the past, the printed atlases just had a hectare.distribution map, just a single map for each species. But this online atlas will allow us to map species in a number of ways. So this is just a few examples for Asperula cyananchica, squinantiwort. So you can see on the left here, we've just got the hectare distribution of this species with its native distribution with the blue dots. And you can probably pick out there's a couple of red dots here where it's been introduced, so the red dots are introductions. But we're able to map this against the underlying geology, and in this case it's the chalk and limestone, so you can see quite clearly that this species is almost entirely restricted to the calcareous bedrock within its native range. but we can also have other underlayers for other species, such as rivers or topography, which helps to sort of help us interpret the distribution of these species. Okay, and then this map in the middle just shows the tetrad frequency of Asperula. So what we mean by tetrad frequency is within each of these 10-kilometre grid squares, we can actually map the number of tetrads, so the number of 2 by 2 kilometre grid squares that it occurs in. So obviously each hectad has a maximum of 25, and this sort of colour scale just represents the sort of the range up to 25 within the hectad. So you can see that it has a particularly high frequency at the tetrad scale down here in sort of North Hampshire into sort of Berkshire, and then up here along the Chiltern Scarp. So that's the tetrad frequency map. The other innovation that we can use for plants in this next atlas is this map here, which actually shows the gains and losses for Asperula since the last atlas. So the pale orange squares is just the historic range, and the pale squares just mean where it was recorded last time and it's still present this time. The little up arrows are where it's appeared, so it's been recorded in that square for the first time, and the little down arrows are where it's been lost. And this just shows a comparison between this atlas recording period, so 20 to 2019, and the previous recording period, which was 1987 to 1999. So we can show lots of this distribution data in different ways this time around. I should also say that we're currently planning to cover or provide information for around about 1,500 natives and nearly 2,000 aliens. So there's going to be getting on for 4,000 species mapped on this online atlas with multiple maps for each of the species. Okay, so the other main feature of the atlas will be the captions. So these were included in the last atlas, the new atlas that was published in 2002. So this just gives you information on the sort of habitats of the species, also whether they're native or alien, some idea of change, which was for the last atlas was the change index, which was a calculation of the sort of change in hectad frequency between the first and the second atlas, and also information on how it changed and reasons for losses and things like that. So we'll be including this information again with the distribution map, but importantly what we'll be doing is updating these captions to take into account changes that have taken place since the publication of the new atlas in 2000. So in this case this is the caption for bee orchid. And as I mentioned earlier, this species has increased dramatically since 2000, and we think this is because of milder winters. So it's definitely spreading its range both northwards and infilling across its sort of core range. And we also think it may be changing its ecology slightly. So in the past, it was a species we associated more with calcareous grassland. Now it's you can find it in all sorts of habitats and different soil types, so it could be broadening its sort of habitat range as well. So we'll be doing a lot of work to update these captions for Atlas 2020. And the other important part of Atlas 2020 that's going on this year is that we'll be reanalyzing the long-term trends to basically replace the change index that was published for the last atlas. And I won't go into anything about detail in terms of the method, because that's not really my specialism. But we're using a method that attempts to take into account the very uneven recording effort between the different recording periods for the different atlas periods. And this work's going to be undertaken this summer by Ollie Pescott at CEH. And this is the sort of output that it will generate. So we'll just have a sort of trend line across the sort of decade since 1970, just showing whether the species is increasing, has remained stable, or has declined. And this was some work that Ollie did for the State of Nature, so this was sort of preliminary analysis. And for bee orchid, it showed quite a consistent increase since the 1970s, which certainly is borne out by the distribution maps. Okay, so we plan to launch Atlas 2020 in the spring of 2022. Sorry, that's a bit optimistic. That should say 2022 there. Yes, we've definitely passed the spring of 2022. So we've got about 16 months left, which sort of fills me with complete horror, because there's a huge amount to do before we actually launch the Atlas. So over the next 16 months, myself and my colleague Pete Stroh, shown here on Colonsay last year, trying to photograph bog orchid on a very extremely wet bog up on Colonsay, up in the Hebrides. We'll be doing an awful lot of work over the next 16 months, working with volunteers and also with CEH, initially to check the maps. So obviously all those 4,000 taxa have maps, and there's a huge amount of work to basically check for errors, but also assign status to a lot of the hectads where the records have come in with no status assigned. So there's a huge amount of work to complete on those. We hope to finish that by the end of March next year. Also working with volunteers, there's a huge amount of editing to do on the captions, and also because we're including quite a few new species for Atlas 2020, there's quite a lot of actual writing of captions as well. So that work will be taking place throughout 2021. There's also the analysis to establish the trends for all taxa. That work will be undertaken by Ollie Pescott at CEH, and we'll be working with him to sort of interpret those trends. And that should start to take place once we've checked all the maps over the coming few months. And then finally, there will be a summary report that will go with the launch of the Atlas, which will really just bring together all the main findings and basically say what it all means. And that will also include information on individual countries, and we'll be working with the BSBI country committees to produce that. So all being well, fingers crossed, all that work will be completed by the end of next winter, and hopefully the Atlas will then be launched in spring of 2022. Okay, so that's all I wanted to say. So I hope you enjoy the rest of the BSBI AAM, and I'll now hand you back to the organisers. Thank you very much.